So welcome everyone to the fifth of our International Economic Law Collective Conversations as part of the International Economic Law Collective response to the current crisis. We decided to start bringing ourselves together to reflect on the broader repercussions of the international economic law order on the world, and in particular on that kind of world that the international legal order has constructed and is now being confronted with this very difficult reality. Today, we're gonna talk about the right to food in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. As usual, we're gonna start thinking about it in terms of international economic law, which means we're gonna start to think about it as an international problem, but we're gonna bring into that conversation how it is operating through international legal norms and institutions, but then also thinking about how it's affecting domestic municipal realities. So before we say something a bit more substantive about what we're going to discuss today, I want to introduce myself and then let my co-speakers to introduce themselves. So my name is Luis Eslava. I'm a reader in law at Kent Law School. I also teach at the University of Melbourne and at the Universidad Externado de Colombia. I work on international economic law and international law and development. And my research uses social legal methods to think about how the international legal order affects life at the ground level. So the next person to introduce will be Michael.
Thank you, Luis, and thank you, Clair and Annamaria, for being here, and everyone who's watching. So my name is Michael Fakhri. I'm an associate professor at the University of Oregon School of Law. And as of May 1st, so coming up soon, I'll be the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food. And my research is broadly in all things food and agriculture with a focus on trade and development.
Hi, I'm Clair Gammage. I'm a senior lecturer in law at the University of Bristol. The focus of my research has predominantly been on international economic law and international law and development in the context specifically of North-South regional trade agreements. With the advent of Brexit and with the COVID-19 pandemic now, my work has broadened out much more than it perhaps originally started as. I'm very much interested in issue linkages with trade, so trade and human rights, trade and gender, trade sustainable development, and trade and agriculture, of course, cross-cuts a lot of those issues. So I'm really excited to be part of this and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Annamaria?
Hi, Luis. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Luis, for involving me in this conversation, and Claire and Michael for being all together today. I am a professor of law at the University of Nottingham, and I work on issues linked to international development. I focus in particular on aid and food aid, and I looked at aid for a very long time. And I, in particular, focus on the role that the state can play to promote development through its purchasing power. And in this particular period, I'm looking at the food purchasing programs that the state put in place for schools, for prisons, and for hospitals. So, you know, it's very exciting to be here today discussing with the new rapporteur.
Thank you all. Thank you all. And as you listeners have discovered, we are having this conversation because the right to food is very important, but because we have in this virtual room the upcoming most important voice in international law about this important right. So we're going to hear about Michael, his preliminary ideas about what he wants to do with his mandate, but also, of course, how those ideas are in direct conversation with the work of many scholars, including Clair's and Annamaria. Maria's work. So my job in these initial minutes is to set up the landscape that we're going to try to cover in the conversation today. So to do that, I want to kind of boil down into 2 points. What are the main issues that have become extremely clear as we kind of advance into this pandemic. And these are issues that are becoming clear today, but then issues that have been around for a long time and has been the topic of very hotly debates over the years. And these two issues are, first, the question of the increasing globalization of food systems. Okay, so the point here is that over the recent years, what we have witnessed is local economies and local productive systems being organized and reorganized again and again in order to serve the global market. This has created two kind of subsets of problems. The first one is we have seen for many years now, and we're seeing today, an increasing kind of superfluous production of goods that do not serve necessarily the local needs or local markets. And the second problem that derives from that globalization of food systems is an enormous destruction of local food systems. It is not simply that local systems have for many years, if not centuries, become increasingly dedicated to monoproduction or to produce a set of goods and staples that are profitable and are needed by the global market. But in so doing, whatever exists on the peripheries of those monoproductive systems are being increasingly obliterated, obviously accentuating the vulnerability of local economies to systemic challenges, including, for obviously, the current pandemic. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that we're seeing, once again, and this is something that we have seen for many years, issues associated to the local exploitation of rural workers and food industry workers. In the UK, for example, The Guardian, the BBC have been constantly reporting how the food industry and the people working in those industries are at the forefront of fighting the battle against COVID-19 by keeping us fed. But many of the workers in those industries are not being kind of treated fairly. And because they have always been understood as kind of a hidden market, labor market, they haven't been the mechanisms in place, or governments haven't put the mechanisms in place to protect those workers. And again, today, and now moving from the UK to the US, the BBC and the Guardian was also reporting how in South Dakota, the main producer of pork, meat, good and products, was or became one of the core hotspots of the pandemic, again because workers were systematically exposed to risk unnecessarily. Okay, so in front of these two problems that I just set up, the question of globalized food systems and the local exploitations of rural workers and food industry workers, what we have been witnessing over the past weeks is a series of responses by international organizations. Here I'm just going to characterize this response by paying attention to what Jürgen Vogel, the Vice President for Sustainable Development at the World Bank, said in terms of how we should approach the question of food and this particular point. Vogel was very good at kind of pinpointing to the fact and showing to the global public that the World Bank indeed thinks in a sophisticated manner the question of food. For example, Vogel was insisting that countries had to continue to extend direct food aid to people and families in need, together with cash transfers. The World Bank sponsors and supports the idea of green corridors for the trade of agricultural products to continue to circulate across the market, and many other kind of sophisticated measures. But at the end of the day, and this was Vogel's point, the World Bank wants to see an ongoing commitment of the circulation of food. He put it in terms of keep food moving. And the idea behind that is according to the World Bank, the global system of food production is thriving, is very strong, and it is very strong because food have been moving for a long time and should keep moving. So basically, the call here is no restriction for experts, business as usual, thing will be fine, keep doing the same. So with that, I just want to pass it now to Michael to start helping us to think about whether this solution presented by the World Bank is the one that we should kind of follow, or if there's other ways of thinking about the problem as a whole and solutions ahead.
So I think, thank you. That's a great way of outlining some of the issues before us. And what I want to start with, so it's interesting with the World Bank, and you see this out of other international organizations, is there's a legitimate concern about how global supply chains have been disrupted, both global supply chains and local supply chains. And supply chains is such an abstract term. What that really means, I think, in a way that's more concrete, is how do the people who grow food and make food and raise the animals that we depend on for food, how do they get that food to the people who need it? When you start framing things in terms of hunger and need and food security, rather than trade, and implied in the quote you have from the World Bank and other organizations, so if we, instead of thinking about the economy or profits or market stability, if you start with your first point of order being hunger and food security, and then deal with all those other issues, economics and development and profit and stability of companies and all of that, you start seeing things a little differently, and you prioritize things a little differently. So global supply chains are being disrupted, local supply chains are being disrupted, meaning people are going to where they usually get food, whether it's a supermarket, whether it's public markets, informal markets, whatever, and there's no food available. And it's not because there isn't enough food to go around. For decades now, agriculture and food has been about surplus management. Globally speaking, we've always had, for at least 50 years, if not a bit more, we've always had globally more food than we know what to do with. But that's a good thing. You always want, especially with food, as we all know, starting in our own kitchens, you always have backup, things spoil, things go bad. You're creative with what you have. You need those, what's so-called redundancies, to make sure you don't go hungry. So we've always had more than enough food to go around. So the debate has always been about distribution. And to put it in less economic terms, it's about sharing. It really is about who has extra food, who is hungry, and who do we share our food with, right? So again, I always try to think of terms in food terms, in gastronomical terms, in terms of how do we feed each other, how do we feed ourselves? So that's just sort of in a broad sense of how I would start a little differently than the World Bank and others, where the emphasis often is economic development. Not to say that that issue doesn't matter, but just I want to start with a different framework. Now, on what I am noticing is many communities, and I'm using the term communities on purpose to keep it ambiguous. Many communities are realizing that they can't wait for existing political bodies to help them, whether it's the federal government, if you're in a federal system, whether it's your local government, whether it's your supermarket or whatever. The usual political and economic institutions aren't doing their job of feeding people. So people are being creative. So we're seeing things like mutual aid groups. What's that mean? That means communities, people on the ground are helping each other out with no criteria other than you're my neighbor, you're my comrade, I see you, I live with you, I'm helping you because I'm also helping myself. So we're seeing that happen. We're seeing sub-national governments. So in the United States, for example, state governments, governors, being very creative in building new alliances with each other to navigate the political landscape. We're seeing different countries helping each other out, sending each other resources. Sometimes it's for geopolitical public relations, so it's very PR. Sometimes it's out of a deep commitment to this idea of solidarity, which we're going to talk about. In all of this and all of these different approaches and different styles, the trade people are really worried about what they would call, or we would call, I guess it depends if I want to be a trade law person today or not, but what trade law people would call protectionism. Don't close the borders, don't create export controls. They're worried about what the sort of in the background is the 2008 food crisis, where prices skyrocketed, prices got really high. So countries reacted very quickly and closed their borders and didn't export food, which disrupted everything. This current situation is different. We're not talking about a price spike, but people are worried about borders being closed, namely the export of goods. I want to frame things not so much as protectionism versus open trade. I think that's too binary, and I think this current pandemic highlights that that's always been too binary. I think the idea of a country being responsible to feed the people within its borders is important, but feeding others. So the place to start with trade is to remember that most people, 80%, I think the number is around 80%, plus or minus, most people get their food not from trade. It's local, however we want to define local or regional. That's the starting point. Trade then becomes an exception. Eating food that is imported is exceptional. It's not the rule. In food law, not in trade law, it's the rule. So if we take trade as the exception, that means then we have to deal with it in those terms, meaning we don't want to put all our political and economic energy then on focusing on imported food, because that's not how you're going to feed people. You want to start with already existing supply chains, which means already existing supply chains, local, informal markets, local markets, regional markets, however we're defining, I mean, that's all going to be different. So with that, then it opens up the question to trade law, to trade institutions, to the WTO, to the FAO, which also deals with trade issues. And it's to ask the trade people to say, well, how can we marshal then the energy and power of trade law and trade institutions in a way that prioritizes food security? Where trade, so right now in trade law, food security often is treated as an exception to trade law. You can stockpile, but only under these very particular circumstances as an exception. And if we flip it and we say our priority to make the distribution and the sharing of food efficient means starting with who needs it, who is hungry, who needs it, who depends on imports. Some communities depend on food imports because of drought, because they're small, because of historical patterns. Start with that and make sure that trade is serving their food needs. So we structure that. And then it opens up the notion of barrier to trade. So what we're seeing, so we can take the World Bank's comments, envelop it in a food security framework and say, okay, keep food moving. Don't disrupt local markets is your priority, and keep it moving and define a barrier to trade in right to food terms, meaning a barrier to trade means anything that's stopping anyone who is hungry or on the verge of famine receiving what they need. That's a different framework of understanding a barrier to trade than it has been in the past. In the past, the barrier to trade was almost anything that was deemed to be a government intervention. So that's some of sort of my broad ideas. And so so here I'll end on the concept that I'm seeing is this idea of self-sufficiency. So it's not, we shouldn't think protectionism, free trade versus protectionism, but the idea of people thinking, I need to take care of myself, but the self is not an individual idea. The self is relational and communitarian. Who we are, people are finding out now. Self can mean your city. It could mean your town. It could mean your region, your state. Yourself could mean an alliance of 3 neighboring countries that all rely on the same rivers, for example. So self-sufficiency, there's a long tradition on the left, and there's a lot of different theories on the left. Self-sufficiency is not autarky. It's not building a wall and being the self-contained, sealed off economy. Self-sufficiency is built on understanding who is my friend, who is my neighbor, building those alliances and taking care of each other as the self. That's always been a tradition on the left, and there's a lot of different theories there. We're seeing it being revived. So I think it's an opportunity to think of trade in terms of self-sufficiency that doesn't caricaturize it as autarky. But the danger is we're also seeing it on the right. We're seeing self-sufficiency wrapped in ethno-nationalist terms, white supremacist terms, literal walls being built. And we see the notion of the self being very internal and closing off one's idea of themselves. And so I wonder if the center of trade discourse is bottoming out and we're left with a right-wing version of self-sufficiency and hopefully a more vibrant left-wing version of self-sufficiency. And that will be the fight in the future. Unfortunately, historically, when the center is challenged by the left and the right, the center tends to veer right, historically speaking. Not always so. And I think there's enough power and energy, and people are realizing this idea of feeding each other and sharing is so visceral that I'm hopeful that we can use that power to rethink our trade regime and food systems.
Thank you, Michael. That's fantastic. And it's very interesting how you have started to kind of provincialize, I suppose, the omnipresence of trade thinking when we think about the right to food. And Claire, I think it's your turn, and I'm sure you're going to take this further.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Michael, because you've actually picked up a number of things I was planning to discuss. It feeds in quite nicely with some of the points that I wanted to raise, which is namely now the time, I think, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, the time is ripe to start to really think about how the trading system can reform. And the question really needs to be whether agriculture should feature within that system at all, and if so, in what guise? How do we work with that? And up until this point, really, there has been, since the Doha round and this commitment to sustainable development, a disjuncture between typically those countries that are monocultural producers in the global south and then countries located in the global north who have big differences over agriculture and what they think agricultural trade should look like. So of course, we're still working on a system that was predominantly based on values from 1986 to 1988 in terms of domestic support. We've got very creative ways of manipulating financial support through subsidy schemes or export credit finance by big major agricultural exporters. And in doing so, we still have massive aspects of trade distortive measures in place. And up until this point, we've seen through the various ministerial conferences modest steps to reform agriculture, but they are extremely modest. And of course, we haven't really progressed since Nairobi, really, the ministerial conference there. And so I think what has happened now with this situation is that we're seeing all of the interconnections between the economy and other aspects of life, and most notably and most critically, how important food is and the supply of food, not only to us as humans to flourish, but also in terms of the economy. The economy cannot function if you do not have workers who are fed to then work in that economy. And so I think that what we're seeing now is perhaps an opportunity to really shed a light on how that system could be changed at the WTO, for example, in the multilateral framework, and in a way that could hopefully start to disentangle some of these structural inequalities that have become really embedded because of that system. Now, of course, we already have the framework of special and differential treatment within that system, but it's like I always say to my students, think about the countries that benefited from that system initially in 1979. Those countries are still benefiting, so to speak, under that system now. It hasn't progressed those countries to integrate into the global economy in the way that it was expected. And part of that is because it's entrenched and embedded these patterns of dependency between certain countries, particularly those in agriculture, around creating communities that are producing one or two products that may not even be those within their local supply chain, but for them to then get out to another supply chain to get out to another country. And so I think that what's quite interesting is that we're seeing a shift even at the multilateral level towards thinking about circular economy. Whether this is just rhetoric or not, whether we can move beyond this idea that it has to be sustainable in theory to being sustainable in practice, I think there's a challenge now for the members of the WTO to think about how creating circular economy in agriculture can enable us to recognize the patterns of food that you've mentioned, in terms of how we use them locally, how do we share these. So for me, picking up on a couple of your points, it's absolutely about sharing, but it's about sharing in an equitable way. And that requires the trading system to move to something that is more equitable, fair, and just. We need a more just trading system. And, as we've said before, whether that means that agriculture is taken out of that system altogether, or whether it's reconceived in quite a significant way, and it will take a significant reconceptualization if it stays within the trading system, because of these very distortive practices around subsidization, around investments, around credit finance, that enable these big players, these big agribusinesses to exploit particular rules and systems. The other thing that really needs to take place, I think, at the multilateral level is a more explicit acknowledgement that we're not dealing with state-to-state behaviors now. This is about behaviors of businesses that are often, have a bigger value than a state's GDP. It's about them exporting goods and importing goods and moving them through complex supply chains. And the difficulties I have is that we can reduce this down to this economic rationality or this logic of trade liberalization. And all that does is remove the importance of the social from those discussions, and reframing it around something like hunger or around food security enables you to just see it in such a different way. And so I think that in terms of moving beyond that binary of trade liberalization and protectionism, there are ways forward, I think, for both the WTO, but also through regional trade agreements, which have so far really just reinforced those inequalities that exist at the multilateral level, but in a way that enables countries to cherry pick who they want to do that with and for what purpose. So if you look through, where my interest has lied so far predominantly has been EU, African, Caribbean, Pacific, we see huge existing and ongoing patterns of dependency where one product is leaving a Caribbean country destined for the UK, and it's this kind of dependency on one market that's really problematic and means that if there is a disruptor to that pattern, so if, for example, we have a pandemic and you can no longer get that good out of your country, what happens to your local workforce? Your local workforce is no longer working. If you look at South Africa, for example, at the moment, they've put a trade restriction on the export of wine and beer because the labor in those markets is deemed to be non-essential at this time. So that means you've already got trade restrictions coming in. And I think that we need to think about how regional trade and also regional preferences within regional trade agreements, so how you can trade within your partner countries, should be seen as bringing a supply chain closer to those countries so that food isn't traveling as far through the supply chain, it's feeding the local communities more effectively. And I think that this comes back to the idea that gets very lost in the trading discourse, is that food is a cultural issue. Food is about cultural identity. Food is about the locality that you're in and what your particular nutritional needs are. And so I think that both at the multilateral level and at the regional levels, we need to start thinking creatively about how we can move beyond state-to-state interactions to take into account the fact it's actually complex transnational global value chains and supply chains that are dealing with agriculture, and in a way that refocuses this debate around, as you've said, hunger or the right to food, so that we can just completely reframe our analysis. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Claire. That's really really great. And then you brought the point about, so Michael was provincializing trade, and then you were now provincializing how we think about food, not just only a question of economic kind of as an economic question, but also as a cultural question, and which obviously brings the point about which culture we're talking about, which always changes from place to place. So Annamaria, I think you're going to take it from there.
Yes, thank you, Luis, and thank you, Claire and Michael. What you just said really made me think. If I look at my research and what I've been working on at the moment, as how can we make sure that the state can play a role in promoting this self-sufficiency, in promoting this local production, in going, and how can we ensure that the agreements that are currently in place that are very much focused on trade and the state-to-state interaction and are mainly focused on how to ensure the barriers to trade are eliminated. If we think about the EU, for example, it's all about the internal market, but how do these agreements hamper the state's capacity to promote local production, for example? And when we think about the state, we tend to forget that the state buys for schools, buys for prisons, buys for hospitals, and it could play a very essential role in promoting self-sufficiency and in promoting sustainability, in promoting zero-kilometer food, for example, but also in sustaining farmers and local production. And if we think more globally about the fact, more broadly about the fact that local farmers are often also places where we encounter poverty, real poverty. If we think about migrants, as Luis was mentioning at the beginning, migrants that work in local farms, and we don't have to think about, I mean, we can think about places very close to us where still gross violations of human rights happen in farms and in the agricultural sector. And so what should be the role that the state plays in there as well in preventing those misconduct to happen? But when we think about, you know, the state and the role that the state can play in terms of promoting self-sufficiency and local production, and the barriers that these trade agreements create, it all automatically changes when we look and we approach it from the perspective of food security and the right to food, I think. So it's just a matter of trying to learn to change the perspective and the paradigm, shifting the paradigm towards what we think is more important and what is essential. And I think that we need to really work harder on this, because if we look, for example, what are the current policies, I think the states have been prevented by this agreement from even purchasing sustainably and from, despite the big talk on sustainability, I don't think that this is currently happening. You know, for example, if I think about the Constitutional Court of Italy, in 3 instances, has found activities of regional laws being unconstitutional because they were providing for purchasing schemes for that favored local production. So, you know, we really need to work harder in the way we interpret the agreements that are signing, the way international law and trade law interacts. But I mean, one of the aspects that this pandemic has revealed, I mean, there have been many inequality aspects that have been highlighted even by the previous podcast by the IEL Collective. I mean, we had a fantastic podcast by Celine, Paolo, and Serena a few weeks ago about inequalities and structural inequalities. And I think that really food insecurity is one of the many specific ways in which the materiality of this inequality manifests itself. And so really not knowing when you will get food, how you will get food, not be able to buy food anymore because you have lost your job, because you made furlough, at the same time while food prices are rising, can be really a big constraint for families. And one of the issues that I'm looking at the moment is how the pandemic has affected the right to food for children, and for those children who especially benefited from school meals and have lost that meal due to school closures. And here the reactions of governments have been very different across the world. And so while some governments have put in place schemes that provide vouchers, that provide alternative provisions for children. This has not be the same everywhere. And I'm thinking, for example, Italy has been one of those countries that, yes, they have provided food vouchers and some food schemes for municipalities to be distributed, but really there are very few indications on how this food is to be distributed, when and where is it going to be given, and whether all the children that used to go to school benefit from these vouchers. This is still very, very unclear. You know, let's think about children of migrants, for example. Will those be included? Are those being reached? So I think this, for me, are some very real and strong problematics that are being raised by this pandemic, and we need to think carefully about these issues and understand how to address it, and sometimes, you know, really the way the regulatory framework is structured can affect the responses and can increase inequality. So, you know, the fact that sometimes there is autonomy of school, autonomy of regions, has meant that the responses have been very different within countries and between countries. So not just between countries, but also within countries themselves, often with the most deprived community being the worst affected. So I think these are issues that we need to consider and we need to look at.
Thank you. So I just want to put an additional question on the table, and this is about what kind of reacting to what I just heard. So it seems very clear for all of us, I feel, that it is the current pandemic is asking us to reconceptualize seriously how we think about food, and what I feel here is that this comes from us all belonging to a generation that learned to think about food in international trade terms. And as Michael was putting it very clearly, when you think about internationally, how we, how, you know, the food that we consume and the food that we enjoy and the food that keep us alive, most of that is provided not through trade. Okay, so and that's really important. One is because, I mean, it seems that analytically we have here an issue, but secondly, because we have learned to think about food in international trade terms, that has generated patterns of production that are not necessarily the ones that we need in order to provide and attend to local needs. It is not just then an analytical problem, it's actually a material problem. And this is becoming clear in so many different kind of areas and sectors of national economies. So, for example, in terms of, as Annamaria was putting it very clearly, in terms of procurement practice of the state, instead of thinking about the economy that provides food to these people, it places faith and attends to the desires and the dictums of international trade law, which is source the food that is cheapest, even though it can come from whatever part, which means that it becomes very fragile and susceptible to be disrupted. But it also, in terms of the negotiations that we conduct in international multilateral organizations or regional organizations. So I just want to, kind of the question that I have in mind is, what is then the value, okay, of thinking about food using as our emphasis the other thing that is circulating in this conversation, when is the language of rights, okay? So what is the value of thinking about food if we think about it in terms of the right to food? And I'm putting this question here because, again, we are all part of a generation that I think we all became lawyers and scholars and academics loving human rights, and they have increasingly become worried about how much we can get from it. Okay, so maybe the rapporteur on the right to food can help us to start figuring out what is then the value to think about food in terms of rights.
Thank you, Luis, and everyone. So I'll add another related aspect and then there's the issue of rights, and there's the geographic question of why local. What are the benefits of local? Let's not take it for granted. There's a good argument to say what does it matter whether it's local or not, as long as you get your food from somewhere, right? There's that element at play, and that argument is resonating today. So first on the issue of rights. So for me, I think the right to food, there's something very specific about the right to food. So for me, I don't really think in human rights in a broad theoretical framework, nor do I think of human rights as something specific that came out of the West from the 1970s, which is a prevalent argument that we've been hearing. For me, it's each particular right has around it its own community. The right to food, what's exciting is it has a long-standing movement, social movement, that understands the powers and the limits of rights from the front end. And so this is a movement of peasants, of fisher folk, of pastoralists, and more people from cities are entering this broad movement that have tried to energize the right to food as a way to access institutional power, to access the FAO, to access the WTO, to access national governments, to engage with all different types of levels of government. So framing food as the phrase goes, as an entitlement and not charity, shifts the power away from the benevolence of whoever happens to have the store of food, to the demand of we all are responsible to each other, to feed each other, and our leaders therefore are accountable to us to make sure that we can feed each other and that the state uses its power to do so, and to build on Claire's point, in an equitable manner. So the right to food is there's a real social power already existing globally that's grounded in the specificities of everyone's particular ways of eating and sharing. The other thing I like about food, so then connecting to why local, again, how we define it, city, county, regions, cities working together, whatever, that's the geographic debate, that's the political debate. It allows people then to engage in a way that holds the political bodies accountable in a way that makes sense.
Yeah.
Right? So then it's hard to hold the WTO accountable. It's hard to hold the FAO accountable. People are working on that, but it's politically and institutionally easier than to use the concept of rights to say to your specific, you see them, you see them walking down the street, right? I see the mayor of Eugene, Oregon. I see her, she walks her dog and I say hello, right? There's meaning in that where we engage with each other as neighbors, the metaphor, right? So I think the idea of local is attractive. Global supply chains, then it gets lost. Who's controlling what? Companies themselves have trouble controlling their own supply chains, right? The issue of child labor, for example. You see this in hazelnut production in Turkey. You have the influx of Syrian families who need work and they're putting their children to work. And companies like Ferrero Rocher, who make Nutella, are saying, obviously we don't want child labor. We have very little control over our supply chain. So companies themselves want help. They're asking for help. They can't control their own supply chain. So let's take that at face value. And the last point, that the specificity of food and the right to food, and not just human rights, is a theoretical concept. So again, you start with a meal. You start with not just hunger, let's start with a meal. If we start with understanding different theories of hospitality, who do you feed first? You sit at the table, who do you feed first is a very cultural thing. And there's meaning and power in it. Do you feed your guest first? Do you feed the elderly first? Do you feed the child first? Every table, every family, every culture does that differently. So you build your political economy around those shared notions of hospitality. In Lebanon, you feed your guest first, and you feed them the best piece, right? Who gets the best piece? So you can expand that and think of that. So there's something I really find the right to food. And then our comrades in right to water are going to have their own dynamics. And then the difficulty, that was the easy, then the difficulty is then connecting all those different aspects together.
Thank you. I think, Claire, I would love to hear what you think about what just Michael said, but in the institutional context between this dispute between multilateral organizations and regional organizations, when we think about food in terms of a right.
Yes, I mean, most of my work is actually focused on thinking about development in terms of capabilities and entitlements and freedoms. And I think that there's a lot of power if we reconceive that discourse within the trading system, because if you look at hunger as a deprivation and food, the right to food, as an entitlement, it just changes the dynamic of the discussion that you then have within those forums. So for example, Amartya Sen, one of his earliest pieces was in relation to famine and following the droughts. And one thing he said that was very powerful is that, you know, ownership of food is one of the most primitive forms of property rights. We know within economic systems, the language of individual rights and especially property rights can be very powerful. And actually, if you think about the right to food as a right, as an entitlement, not only does that change the way you can talk to your local governments or your state governments, it changes the way you can engage with institutions, because it then says, this is not about me having access to something. I have a right, I have an entitlement to that under this particular system. So the system has to be restructured in a way that enables me to access that. Now, in terms of what Annamaria has pointed out around procurement and the ways in which trade agreements, but also multilateral rules can interfere, even if you frame it as an entitlement, there are massive obstacles that need to be overcome. But one thing that I have found quite promising about the COVID-19 pandemic and the reaction from the WTO to that is that if you just go onto its website at the moment, the opening page says, you know, can we restrict products? And it's giving you this, you know, very basic and accessible explanation of why countries at the moment can completely deviate from the rules. The reason being that they will have good social policy reasons for doing so. So what that has shown someone like myself who's been doing this for a while, but it shows everyone who's in the field and also those who know nothing about trade, is that these rules are there, but they can be broken when they need to be broken for good reasons. And that, I think, should serve as a point of reflection to say, are the rules the right rules for this in the first place? Should we just tear up the rule book altogether and reformulate them? And if we do that, if we reframe it around this idea of an entitlement, rather than just something that we think we should have, no, it's something that you are entitled to have, you can then embed that in different ways. You know, a regional trade agreement can help, but a regional trade agreement only gives you a preferential access to a market. You can still access that market without using the preference, okay? It's just for the business to benefit from getting into that market or getting out of that market, depending on what it's doing. So I think it's around, I personally think we need some quite bold reconceptions of the system. I'm not sure what happened just yet, but starting, you know, with reframing the way we understand things and around entitlements is really important from my point of view. Seeing it about capabilities, about people's freedom, and about people's ability to live their lives the way that they think is fulfilling to them, that needs us to move away from this idea that trade is the end of development, we're there for economic growth, to seeing trade as being a means towards development, as being understood as much bigger things around social and human growth.
Thank you. And Annamaria, so again, rights. And one thing that I really found interesting about what you said before is that you are interested in both. You are interested in terms of the supply side of questions. So how to make sure that people that need food get the food that they need, but also you are interested in quality. And I think right here becomes even more complex. Okay, so right is not only I need to have X amount of food in order to survive, I also want to have food that is good and then provide the nutrients, and also then doesn't cause the damage that some of the food production systems are causing.
Yeah, and I think this gives us an opportunity, you know, to think with the lens of rights. I think that you were mentioning before, I think gives us an opportunity to think what is best for those who you are responsible for, who is being left behind by your policies. Women, for example, you know, children, as we were saying before. But so in this perspective, we see also, you know, the entitlement of someone becomes the responsibility of someone else. In this case, becomes the responsibility of the state. The state that, you know, has this double role of being a provider and being an influencer of the production chain. So the provider, when it purchases food, as I was telling you before, for the various activities that it runs, but also influences the production chain, not only with the various regulations that it can put on food in terms of food quality and everything else, but also by deciding where to purchase from. And the state also, so the state can access the most vulnerable, but it can also have an impact on the most vulnerable by empowering them through the production chain. So for example, if I think about the program that Lula and Rousseff had implemented in Brazil on the food purchasing programs that they had on rural production inclusion, where they were promoting access to food and foster family farming at the same time. With programs by the state that were procuring directly from family farmers. You know, this is a brilliant way of promoting the access to food and empowering communities through the production that they can put in place themselves. And so we come back to that self-sufficiency, that sustainability, the localization that is so important. And I think if we want to reimagine international trade law, this is through, I think we need to use this lens to reimagine it, looking at local tradition, looking at local production, as Michael and Claire were saying at the beginning, because, you know, think for instance of fishermen, all the local traditions that they have there, and what is happening at the moment in many of the ports, for instance, that are being built, you know, how the trade, this, you know, the ports best than anything else emphasize this element, this aspect of trade, the materiality of trade, and then at the same time the effect that it has on the local community and the fishermen. So, you know, I think when I think about food and how the right to food can affect things, I automatically think about this dual aspect of access, being fed, and production.
Fantastic, thank you. So I think we need to start wrapping up, and I want to kind of have another at least 2 extra rounds. So I'm going to ask everyone to keep the answers short. What I'm going to kind of discuss very quickly is that we are all here together talking about food, the right to food, food and trade, but most of all, we're brought here by the pandemic. Okay, so now the question is, how much you think this pandemic is going to force those changes that we have been discussing? Okay, and this is not just you know, let's play a game of, you know, second guessing, but we all agree of the seriousness of the problems that were happening before and are happening now. So the question about how much things are going to change is crucial. And I think I'm thinking about the kind of topics that have been put at the center of conversations again and again today, but again in recent years when we try to think about these complex global problems. And the two concepts that I have in mind is the question of vulnerability. We have become very attuned to the fact that people suffer very differently because they are very differently vulnerable to different challenges and forces. And on the other side, the idea of resilience. So vulnerability and resilience have become kind of very much part of our intellectual repertoire. And my question is, how much you're going to be able to overcome vulnerabilities as a result of this crisis, and how much is going to take us to the realm of resilience. And again, in terms of food, is extremely important. I mean, I started this conversation by talking about globalized food systems and how much they have done to, yes, increase the volume of food being traded, but at the same time destroying the capacity of localities, whatever, however you want to define them, following Michael. But in any case, how much they have destroyed the ability of communities to be resilient. Okay, so maybe we can start through, so say Claire, just to change the order very quickly. Yeah.
Caught me off guard then.
Sorry.
So what I would say is that I think that we have to change the way we do things anyway. I mean, one thing that's come out from Brexit that I just find so peculiar is that, you know, we export lamb that we don't eat to re-import lamb that we do eat. So to do with, you know, different cuts of the same product, or that, you know, we export our fish because we don't necessarily want those fish, so we'll import other fish. So I think the one thing the pandemic could do, because we're already seeing price volatility and price increase, is that consumer preferences might change. You know, if the majority of the population in the UK at the moment is looking at precarious job situations or on furlough, they're going to have to start to make different choices about the foods that they eat. There are already trade restrictions, as I mentioned earlier, coming into place from certain countries around rice and wheat. So it's likely that we could see a knock-on effect in the supply chains at some point. And that might push us back towards more traditional British foods like potatoes and, you know, different types of carbohydrates, whereas we've shifted our patterns of eating over the past few decades. So I think that the pandemic will force us potentially to change our eating patterns, to choose different types of foods. But one thing I've been struck by, particularly in Bristol, is the ways in which local communities have just come together to ensure that everybody is eating. And whether that means that they're cooking and then providing that food to people, or coordinating like cooperatives to get food out to people, I think that I've been really heartened by what I've seen in local communities. I still remain very concerned about the most vulnerable in our society, including children. I think that the provision of school meals is going to be really important. Again, in Bristol, what we've seen, and I'll finish here, but what we've seen here is that even if there's a threat to that system, other cooperatives are coming into play to make sure that children do get fed. So I think that culturally, you know, going back to Michael's point, I think I'm Welsh heritage, and in Wales we feed children first. And I think that what we're seeing in Bristol particularly is, and across the UK, is that children have to be fed and the elderly have to be fed. And so I think we're going to see hopefully perhaps a greater sense of community come out of this. But I do think that the price volatility, the price increase, is going to force us to make different choices.
Yeah, thank you. Annamaria, would you like to follow that?
I don't know, because I've been trying to think really and wanting to be optimistic on how the pandemic might change our perception of things and our ways of doing things, and yes, there are opportunities from every catastrophic event. We can find opportunities and understand that we need to rethink our way of thinking, revalue things. But probably one thing that this pandemic has taught us is that we need to act fast in terms of how we need to see the most vulnerable and understand who these most vulnerable are. And I think that we're hearing much more conversation about vulnerability. So let's not make this conversation finish once the pandemic is over. Let's remember that these people that we have identified as vulnerable will continue to be vulnerable afterwards. So I hope that this will happen after the pandemic.
Thank you, that's brilliant. Michael, things are going to change.
So I think the pandemic, in many ways, you know, we all use the word reveal, but I love how Claire qualified. It revealed to some, but to many people who have been oppressed or under pressure already knew the problems, or those of us that sort of are focused on that. So what it did, I think, is it revealed it broadly, the existing inequalities, but the pandemic accelerated and exacerbated already existing problems. So if you were poor, you're now poor. If you were hungry, you're now hungrier. And if you were well off, there's the profiteers. Some people are better off as a result of the pandemic. So the part that we have to struggle with is this stretched inequality. It's even worse now already, and it's only going to get worse. And the part we haven't had a chance to talk about, but to complicate, you know, of course, climate change is here lurking in every moment that we're in. So, you know, we're not going to go into this particular session, but the pandemic is part of a broader shift of deforestation and our encounter with different species and animals in a way that's it's only going to get worse. This pandemic is almost like a warning shot. It's almost forcing everyone to sit up and ask, and the world is asking us, are you ready? Other communities have already had to deal with climate change on the front lines. So for my work, I know in the Arctic, there's no debate about climate change. It's more a question of adaptability, and fundamental shifts of life are already happening in certain ecosystems, such as the Arctic. So I think a lot of the answers are going to come from those communities that have been thinking about this for a longer time. And I think those communities that have been more comfortable now are feeling it and are going to have to respond. That idea of changing, it's going to change how we eat, sort of thinking about what Claire is saying. I think we always change how we eat. And the notion of traditional is not something that freezes in time. So the potato is traditional, but at one point it was brought in from the New World, right? So it keeps the idea of creating new traditions. So building on it. So tradition, the difference between tradition and modernity is a different theory of time. So we've all had to slow down whether we liked it or not. We've all had to worry about feeding our families and each other as a priority in ways we haven't had to do that before. We've all seen through the co-ops and through the schools that feeding people takes a lot of work and a lot of time, and you're lucky if you have any energy left over. If we can capture that culturally, and here if I can, I'll end my remarks on something slightly utopian, if I may, just because I have this really dark feeling today, just really, not hopelessness, it's this feeling of it's still going to get worse and we still have a lot of struggle ahead of us and pain is ahead of us. Recently there's a lot of holidays are at play. It's springtime, right? Nowruz for the Iranian and Persian community, Passover for the Jewish community, the Catholic Easter has passed, the Orthodox Easter is coming up this Sunday. These holidays always come with food and eating and community. Certain businesses depend and are structured on those holidays. So if you're a business that was waiting for Easter to sell that lamb or whatever, and this is the moment where all of your profits, this is the holiday that sustains your business, and that holiday is passed and you couldn't do it. There's a weird power. Only now am I appreciating the weird power of holidays, of celebration, of structuring food in a political economy around those holidays. In the United States, they have their Thanksgiving. There's the whole country stops, and there's a different pattern around a holiday. It's an exceptional moment of both celebration and sharing of resources and meals. It almost makes me think that we truly need, after this, a new holiday, an international holiday, reminding each other how hard this is, reminding each other how we take care of each other, reminding each other to feed each other, right? To feed each other in new ways, to have those new dishes, those new, there's certain dishes I know, I wait for them. I wait for this saint's holiday or that whatever holiday, and I call my mom up, and it forces me to call my mother, I have to now call my mom, get the recipe, we have a nostalgic moment, and then all of that, that's meaning. So it forces a different understanding of value, of what we value. So the good thing that is coming out of this pandemic is people are connecting and are reminded that social and cultural relations are the foundation of everyday life. And we build on that.
Thank you. Just to conclude very quickly, I'm just going to pass you the final words to Annamaria and Claire. What you just said is so interesting, especially when I hear it as an international lawyer, because immediately reminds me the difficulties of thinking about different ways of being away from the institutions and the norms that have created the present. So what I'm hearing from you is trying to reimagine how we understand food and how we create social relations and networks of solidarity around food that are less oppressive and less destructive. But then it's always that challenge that we know as lawyers, and especially in particular international economic lawyers, that there is a hard wall there waiting for us. The reality comes and kicks back once again and then forces us into particular kind of patterns that in the context of food has been very destructive. So, and I'm saying that because of the importance of solidarity and the importance of reimagination, so that bit of ourselves as international lawyers, it needs to be always kept in check. We know you're going to come back, but I also need to be ready to question you. Claire, this is your final chance.
So I think that, first of all, I'd say it's been a real privilege to be part of this. So thank you to all of you, and especially to Michael, to come online and to talk in, I suppose, one of your first conversations in your new role. So that's exciting. I think something that strikes me from this conversation is that I think there will be a lot of hope amongst certain groups that things can change. Perhaps what's quite significant about the pandemic in the context of food is that you're seeing countries that have formerly been quite buffered from any kind of shock, certainly since 2007, 2008 in relation to food, suddenly feeling that shock again. And like Michael, I don't want to be pessimistic, but I think that unfortunately this is the tip of the iceberg. I think that we're going to start to move into uncharted territory pretty soon if we're not already in it. And so I think that there could be more momentum to move forward in ways to sort of change the way that we do things and the way that we see things in a way that does build on this sense of solidarity that seems to be coming out in a lot of communities. My overriding concern remains with the role of multinational corporations, of big agribusiness. And so I think whatever forum these discussions take place in around the intersection of agriculture and trade, from an IEL perspective, they need to make sure that there is a very meaningful engagement with stakeholders from across the board, not just stakeholders like NGOs, but stakeholders like grassroots and individuals from indigenous communities who are affected the most by some of what are these norms that have come to structure our social life. So I think that I would say going forward, I hope that we have meaningful participation from lots of groups, but I think that there are a lot of challenges ahead, and I think that there will be companies and businesses that will want to harness the power they currently have under the existing regimes.
Thank you. Annamaria.
Let me just say really again, thank you to all of you for this honor to be with you all today. And it's let's hope really that this pandemic will bring something positive. I think what you've been saying before about these networks of solidarities that have formed during the pandemic, let's try to identify and strengthen them so that now that they have emerged and now that everybody can see them, because as Michael was saying, these networks were already there, the solidarity was already there, in the same way as poverty was already there. But let's try to strengthen these networks of solidarity. And my hope is that this pandemic will somehow lead to a redistribution of the resources, because this is at the end what we really need. Reevaluation of those jobs that we haven't valued enough in the past. Hopefully politicians will see how what have that people that deliver our food have, because I think these have been really the portent of our society. We would have collapsed if we didn't have these people still working at the moment. And yeah, I really like the imagine of Michael was saying, doing this at the moment, being abroad, being migrant has been something that we felt even more during the pandemic, not knowing when we will go back is one of the harshest feelings, but maybe we can, but we have found other networks. So I think this is what I hope will come out of this pandemic, strengthening these networks and revaluing, as Michael and Claire were saying, things that we haven't valued enough in the past.
Thank you. As Michael put it,
Okay.
and I think he's a chair filling in this virtual conversation. I think the pandemic has been a very strong reminder and a warning of what's coming, but also it has forced us once again to see all of those things that have been happening over the years and that have come to confront the current present in a way that we really need to reformulate and to reorganize. So I just want to conclude by thanking everyone. It has been an absolute pleasure to have this conversation at this difficult time with all of you and learning from all of your work. I want to echo what Claire just said and what Annamaria said. It has been a massive pleasure to share this room with Michael. We all feel extremely proud of him taking up this very, very important job at this very important time in our global history. Michael has been a close friend of mine and a comrade for many years, and it just I'm so happy and so excited to see what he's going to produce and how he's going to help us to think about other futures. I mean, we need other futures urgently. For the viewers, thank you for your patience. This has been a long conversation. Again, this was the 5th of IEL Collective Conversations. The IEL Collective came together last year with the aim of creating a new space to think about international economic law, yes, but more broadly, the global economy in a new way. Please follow our publications, our Twitter accounts, our Facebook account. We also have a series of publications coming through Medium. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.